Alright, so the first thing we'll look at for this one is the guitars, and I'm just going to turn off EQ on that, put this guitar in mono, and we can have a listen. So it's my tonality plugin, no surprises here. That's my usual kind of OD 808 settings. Amp settings, pretty common for me. Cabinet, using cab 1, bottom left speaker, SM57, and in the second position. So that 0, 0 would be dead center, and still kind of a bright placement, I guess, for this one. But yeah, I don't know why I went for that speaker. Normally I kind of avoid the bottom left or the bottom speakers in cabs, but I think I was just, you know, mixing things up. Then we've got the C4 compressor on the actual channel, individual channel, as opposed to the guitar group, the guitar bus. And you can see it's just working there to tame any of the kind of woomphy, palm mute, low end chugs that are happening. So that's the guitar tone. I've quad tracked it. So the main ones are at -5.5 dB and panned completely hard pan left and right. Then the quad tracks are down at -11.5 and they're panned to 89%. For this rig, using the Maxon OD 808 again. But this time I'm using the XXX, PV XXX. Just going to put that in mono so you can listen to that tone. And then the cabinet, I'm using, so we're 100% on this side, so you can ignore that. So this is cab 1, bottom left, position 3. So that position 3 in my impulse response pack is the more common position that I tend to, that's like the sort of default for each speaker would be number 3. So bottom left speaker again, darker than the other impulse response I just mentioned, but this is sort of the standard, this is sort of just the standard placement that I'd go for on that particular speaker. Cool. So that's how the guitars sound individually, and then on the group. So always super involved with Fab Filter Pro Q3 here. I can talk about everything that I've done. I'm going to just bring these down a little bit. What's that? 2.5, okay. So this area, this is all dynamic EQ. So this is doing the same kind of thing that the C4 compressor, multiband compressor, is doing, but just more specific in the areas that I kind of saw as problematic. So you can see on the really woomphy, chuggy chugs, this area is like really specifically a problem, and I'm also just kind of cutting it out at the same time as having it as a dynamic EQ. You can see it really kind of gets out of hand and it just kind of kicks in on some of those chugs. So you can hear as soon as I boost it, that is a frequency that you just don't want to be too overbearing in your guitar tone. You definitely don't want to just completely remove it. You want a bit of that, and you want your guitars to feel heavy and weighty, and that's where you'll kind of feel it, but it's just, yeah, a bit dangerous. High passing to 75, anywhere between like 60 to 90 is kind of standard for me. I don't like to go too much further up. It really depends on the tuning, but I'm never usually lower than like C sharp. So I kind of tend to stick to, if there's anything problematic here, removing that and leaving a bit more of the subby low end in. Then we're just kind of widely removing 460. And this is a common area that I always tend to notch out. This is very like cab whistle, kind of like. Another area that I don't want to hear too much of, that gives it that sort of nasally sound is anywhere between like 900 to 2K. And I'll just go back to the start. So just to give you some references, Pantera, I'm pretty sure Dimebag scooped at like 1.5 quite a lot. So that's like more extreme than I go, but that's like a lot more of like a Pantera kind of tone. And then if you listen to any of the like old school 90s death metal from Morrisound Studios, that was a lot more like 950 scooped. When you let your ear get used to notching this out, now this is way more extreme than I'd want to do than kind of fits in like the modern era of mixing, but if you get used to listening to this, and then you bring it back in, you will be like, oh yeah, that's a pretty ugly frequency. And if you don't kind of at least consider removing some of this, I just think it's worth, having a play around and letting your ears adjust to scooping it and then putting it back in. So yeah, I don't go super extreme, but I definitely want to get rid of a bit of that kind of area generally. Now up here, this is the main area. So anywhere between like 2.5K all the way to 5K, this is the main area that is the loudest in my guitar tone, usually, at least for like high end. This is where I would say the high end is coming from and upper mids. And then the low end is coming from kind of this area. Those 2 points are what I want to see peaking on my guitar tones, in terms of the loudest point being the high end. Whoops. Accidentally just knocked something. The high end being up in this area and the low end peaking at this area, then everyone else, and then everywhere else just being a little bit lower. So these are just notable problematic areas that I find in most speakers, so you'll be able to see and hear them. I don't think that was meant to have dynamics on it. I might have done that by accident. And then this area, I inevitably kind of boost these areas, or this area in general, and then removing all the really harsh whistly frequencies means you can boost them a bit more confidently. So we got 2.3, 3.2, 2.7, sorry, and 3.2. And then like 4.3, 4.2 can be a problem. I say a problem, it's just kind of an area that I don't like hearing too much of. And then 5.5. Cool. So that's subtractive EQ. And then off the back of that, sometimes I either use like the SSL style, like the Brainworks console, or in this instance, I'm using Amplified Instrument Processor, which is a Core Nef plugin that is kind of catered towards EQ in your guitars. I may have mentioned before, but this is pretty cool. It does an analog channel variance. So any piece of outboard gear is going to have slightly different values, just in the nature of it being, a real piece of equipment, and it's not always going to be exact to what, you might see referenced on like a Fab Filter Pro Q3 kind of EQ. So it's going to give you that slight variation on the left and right side of the mix, which is just going to help with your stereo image if you don't have everything like perfectly EQ'd like in the modern world. So this is kind of emulating having two separate channels on a desk. I may not have described that as accurately as I would have liked to, but that's kind of the color that it's giving. And you can just kind of just set it to randomize and change, and it's very, very subtle. This is the low and high pass filter, not using them. So I'm going to go from right to left, just because I don't know why, where I normally start with guitars. I normally start with the high end down to the low end. So up first, I'm boosting by 2.5 dB at 7.5. And it's It's not that narrow. It's not as narrow as like this, what's indicated here, but it's still like a Q of around 2's, still not like super surgical. So that's just adding a little bit more presence back in. And then here I'm cutting at, yeah, so maybe this is why I've boosted an area that I wouldn't normally boost. I'm cutting at like 6.5 or 6.7 really, a narrower Q, and down by like 10 dB. Well, 9 dB. That's just an area that I typically don't like, and that's just a personal preference. I find, I've sort of mentioned this before, that that's an area where if I remove 6K, I feel like I can still get the brightness through the tone, but clear up some of the more like annoying, kind of sizzly, fizzy sound, and then leave a bit more of the high end above 6K. So I find just going in narrowly around 6K, between 6 and 7, tackles a lot of what I don't like in a guitar tone. And hopefully you can hear what I mean when I put that back in. Up next, I'm boosting by 2.7 at 4K. And that's kind of like the peak of the high end coming through in my tone. That's where it kind of lives, around 3 to 4K generally. And it's kind of, it's not the most pleasing when you just bring it up, but when your ear gets used to it and then you bring it out, you do miss it. Cool. And then lastly, boosting some low end at around 80, 86. And that sounds like this. So not much, but just enough to be doing something. And then this area down here, the insufferable mid-range filter. Now this is essentially just doing what I'm already doing with FabFilter Pro Q3. It's just like you're just notching out an area that you find problematic. With the Pro Q3, it's so good as a frequency analyzer that I can really just see where all the problem frequencies are with my guitar tone. But this doesn't have that, and sometimes I just like shutting my eyes and just moving this wheel around here to find the most offensive frequency and then notch it out. And in this case, it has been 4.1, and I'm removing a bit of like 4.3, and I'm removing it by like 3.5-ish dB. So that's me putting it back in. Anyway, so that is the guitar tone. Up next, we'll look at bass, contact instrument. Someone had asked me this before, and I'll address it again now. The reason I use virtual bass libraries, there's a few reasons. The main one, I don't have a bass, so there's that. I'm not interested in getting a bass, and a few reasons why I find it way more beneficial when I'm writing. Once you get used to programming in MIDI, and as long as you know like what notes, you know, are what in terms of the tuning that you're in and writing in the correct MIDI, it's far easier when I'm writing to sit with a guitar on my lap than have to like put a guitar down, pick up a bass, and then potentially patch it into a different input on my interface, because a bass can have, can be a completely different output to the guitar you're using in terms of setting like a DI level. And one of the main things that I really prefer using MIDI bass for is because when I'm writing, I normally have like 30 projects going at any one time. I might have a song written where I've only got 2 riffs, or I might have a song that I've like haven't finished and it's like 99% there, but I've had it for like 3 or 4 years. I just can't finish that song. The great thing about having MIDI bass means it's easy just to revamp an old demo and not worry about the tone or the bass or guitar you were using at the time. The most important thing to me is when I find an old demo and I can't remember how to play any of the riffs, I can just relearn it really easily from the MIDI. And you'd be surprised the amount of times where I can't actually figure out a riff, how I wrote it, or like what the notes are if it's too fast. And it's just, yeah, it's way easier for me to just revisit a demo with MIDI bass. That, and it just sounds instantly good when you're writing. So yeah, I'm all for it. On records, we still use real amps, real guitars, real bass, real drums. But when writing, whatever sounds the best and makes your demos sound more pro is what I'm all for. So that's why I use MIDI bass. So I'm using Umansky bass here, humanized to that much. I've taken the position down quite a lot because I didn't really want to hear too much of the like clanginess of the higher strings on the lower frets. I'd rather hear it kind of sound a bit fatter. So that's why I've done that. And let's check out the processing. So up first, Pro Q3. Just doing some of that dynamic EQ there, just taming low end, trying to like really solidify the low end. And then I'm doing that again here with Pro MB multiband compressor. I'm kind of just doing it everywhere. And obviously different notes, like a low note to a high note, is going to affect all of these bands differently. So it's another way of just kind of locking down the bass to really kind of pin it down and put it in like its place and keep the low end consistent. So this is going to duck the subs on some of the lower notes, but it's going to leave it and put it back up. I've gone above the neutral point here. So on some of the higher notes, it's going to be sort of boosting some low end back in. Cool. So up next, I'm using Saturn, which is just distorting the mid-range. I completely forgot about this and even looked at this demo for a few months. So I'm just, let's hear it up to that point. Yeah, it's kind of not doing a lot, but it's just kind of adding a bit of pokiness into that area that I like the bass to kind of be heard in the mix over the guitars. So compressing. Then using the Dark Glass Ultra plugin. These are the settings. So I normally set the blend all the way up. And then I'll go back and kind of dial in, bring it back down and get a bit more of the less distorted tone, like DI sound. Cool. And for the cabinet, we're using 52A Dynamic 421. And then up next, Foul Filter Pro Q3 EQ. So again, a bit more dynamic EQ, just kind of taming and controlling this area, a bit more sub, low end back in, and then this area. I mean, the moment I put that back in, you can hear why I got rid of it. And then just taking off some of that high end that we don't really need. It's quite a nice area of high end, it's not too offensive. And I could maybe be a bit more subtle with it and just kind of, you know, do it like that. I just found for this mix, I didn't need that bass tone to be too prominent, or at least have too much high end up there. And then drums, let's dive into it. I'm just going to loop a bit. So for the drums, you'll see I've got something on here, Pro Q3, not doing anything. I think I just like to have Pro Q3 on just so I can look at stuff as I'm EQing things or changing things, and you can EQ the drums within the Contact instrument. So let's have a look. From the start, we're using the Yamaha 24E head. That just means Evans or Remo head in those instances. So for the one-shot sample, I've got this Q kick loaded in. Sounds like that. And then the main kick, or the kick with, you know, the realism in it, is the Yamaha 24E head. And then I've inverted the phase on this channel to get it in phase with that kick. And I've slightly adjusted the pitch of the kick here, just down 7.1, I think, to also potentially help get those two kicks in phase with each other. Up next, the snare. We're using just the Ludwig Black Beauty, not the alt mix, just the general one. And boosting that, the close mic up by 1.1 dB, 5% to the right on the tilt EQ. That's not doing a lot. And I've brought the overhead down 2.3, room down 0.1. Toms, we're using just the Yamaha ones. Pretty much standard, I think, by the looks of it. Got the overhead mics, minus 4.8. Room mics, minus 3.9 on all of them. Again, you can link all these channels, so that's what I normally do. So the link button, they all move together. And if you take that off, you can just move them individually. Cymbals, got the China cranked for some reason. I guess I made it a bit darker here, 57% to the left. And yeah, all of the overheads are up, 5.3. Rooms down like 0.8, not a lot. So yeah, that's pretty much how those drums sound. We can listen to them now. You can hear they're quite wet sounding. Within the mix, you don't hear it as obviously as that, but I've got the reverb here, 38% on the snare, 35 on the toms, no reverb on anything else, just using like room ambience for that. So one thing I'm going to dive into now that people have been asking me about that I tend not to, I just kind of forget to look at, but I have done it on a few of the videos, is looking at my master bus processing, which is pretty straightforward. I've just, so you're aware, I've brought this down minus 2.12 on the master fader just for the sake of recording this video, just to make sure I'm not feeding in too much loud audio into the other computer that is recording the audio. So we can go from the start. EQ. This is like a safety net. I don't really need this here. If I take it off, you don't hear any difference. There's not a lot going on any of the guitars, bass, or like kick drum in this area anyway. So like I said, it's kind of just a safety net. So if I take it off, I guess it can help a little bit tame some of the low end on the kick, but it's not really that noticeable. I don't like heavy-handed master bus processing. Up next, I'm using the solid bus comp from Native Instruments. Not that aggressive in terms of the compression. Attack 30, ratio 3, release as fast as possible, and like minus 1 dB of gain reduction. I find if I over compress, like the low end gets a bit choked up, and you can do a different type of master bus compression with like a high pass filter and do some different things, which I've done. I can show you now, actually, might as well. So another thing you can do, another way of doing compression on your master bus would be using like one of the slate ones like this. High pass to around 80, fast attack, fast release. This way it's kind of not really tackling much of the low end on the kick, and you can kind of duck the snare a bit and have your snare a bit louder in the mix, and then the mix duck around the snare if you want. But I wasn't doing that for this one. I've got tape saturation, which is not doing much. Adding a bit more thump, a bit more glue to it, but I don't overly saturate on the master bus, and I don't always use this. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Flatline I do use a lot. Now, using a clipper or saturation on your master bus mix is an easy way of getting your master loud, but if you can't get your master loud without saturation and clipping, then my experience previously was if I couldn't get my master that loud, then there's a problem with your mix or the way you mix. So if you can't get a master loud just using like a pretty standard limiter and some compression, you should reanalyze your mixing and like make sure that you don't have too much like mud in there and you've made space for everything. So it's really easy to rely on. I love this plugin, Flatline. I've used it since it came out. I think it's great, but it's really easy to get your masters loud, which is why I like it. But I think people that are new to mixing, they could like make their masters super loud by using this without having the finesse of a good mixer. But it's an amazing plugin. So that's pretty much just working on the snare transients. And a bit of the kick, but yeah, shape 95, just clip, ceiling 0. And then lastly, Pro L, just going up 0.5 dB. And that is it for that one.